Hi, welcome back to my channel. My name's Anna. I'm a clinical psychology doctoral candidate. This channel is all about applying psychology to real life situations, and today we're talking about turning anxiety into intuition. So what is intuition? Basically, it's using unconscious knowledge based on sensory information from the environment, so things like having a gut feeling that you shouldn't trust someone because they furrow their eyebrows in the same way as someone who betrayed you in the past. And it is scientifically demonstrated to exist. For instance, Van Helmholtz's unconscious inference task, which shows that we use intuition to guide our decision making and to maximize our chances of survival. So this is something that we can measure that is scientifically shown to exist. Another way of thinking about intuition is less based on sensory information and more based on extrasensory information. So for instance, thinking about a random person from your past and suddenly they message you years later. It wasn't that there was any sensory information that they were going to show up, it was something else. And this one's not as scientifically proven, it's more in the spiritual community than the psychology community. But I think many of us have experienced these synchronicities, as they're called, and kind of wondered what they mean. Many psychologists and spiritualists have theorized that when we're babies and children, our intuition is very strong, but we tend to repress it and we lose it as a skill with conditioning as we grow up. Because we're told we shouldn't be getting our information from this, we should be getting our information from other things. As kind of an aside, I was recently at a jazz club and I realized that jazz is actually a great example of putting intuition into practice. When a jazz musician is doing their thing, it's very in the moment, very intuitive. And they've already mastered the structure and the technique of the music, so now they get to kind of play around with it based on what they're feeling, what their fellow musicians are doing, and what they see in their audience and their surroundings. It's all about leaning into what you're feeling in the moment and modifying your decisions based on what's happening around you, making the best decisions based on what your environment is requiring of you right now. What this means if we treat life like a jazz concert is we have to first know our stuff, to master the technical things we have to master, but then to play around with it a little bit, to take risks based on our intuition, to modify our decisions based on what we're feeling and based on what our environment requires of us. It's essentially about having flexibility and perfectly aligning your internal and external experience. I see X outside of me and I'm aware that I feel Y inside of me. What do I now do with this information? So how does intuition look practically? I'll give you a few examples of how to use intuition in everyday life before we talk about how to distinguish between anxiety and intuition and how to turn that anxiety into intuition. So one example of everyday intuition is intuitive eating. I know this is a term that gets floated around the internet a lot lately, and there are some great books out there on its original meaning if you want to make sure you're not misusing the word. Intuitive eating is all about listening to your mind and your body when you're making decisions about what you want to eat. That means mindfully listening to hunger cues like stomach rumbling and emotional hunger cues like I feel like eating something crunchy and savory right now rather than something smooth and cold. Our body signals to us what we need through intuition. For instance, there's this one case study I learned about in undergrad about a boy who craved a ton of very salty foods. And his parents took him to the psychologist and to the doctor, and they tried to get him to stop eating so much sodium. And in the end, he passed away because he had a rare disease that required he have a much higher amount of sodium than the average person. So his intuition was telling him, eat salty things, and there were fatal consequences when people wouldn't let him listen to his intuition. Another example is I was in the DR last week and I was eating a seafood medley with rice. And I usually love lobster, but there was something about this lobster that just didn't quite taste like lobster. And it was all inclusive, so I convinced myself, no, Anna, you gotta get your bang for your buck. You paid for all inclusive, finish your lobster. And about an hour later, I was hit with some of the worst nausea of my life, threw up, which I almost never do, and my stomach was in knots. And although it could have been from anything, I feel very intuitively that it was from the lobster. And had I listened to my intuition, this could have all been prevented. But on a day-to-day basis, it's not as extreme as these two examples. On a day-to-day basis, intuitive eating means listening to what your body is telling you to have and honoring that. So for instance, if you had a pizza last night and today your body's saying, you know what, I want something a little more nutrient dense, maybe a veggie bowl, honor that. Trust that your body is signaling to you that it needs more nutrients right now. Or if you really want some ice cream after dinner, resisting that impulse might only make you eat 3 other healthy snacks and then the whole pint of ice cream because you're frustrated that those other snacks didn't quite hit the spot. Whereas if you had listened to your intuition from the start, you would have met your needs earlier and with less distress. And maybe you would have the calcium and fat that your body was crying out for. Of course, there are some cases I've heard of where intuitive eating doesn't work for some people. Like if you have issues with your HPA axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary axis, the parts of your brain that control your hunger cues, or you're diabetic, or you have a different neurological or medical issue that means your body is not sending you the right signals about what to eat, maybe it's not for you. And regardless, I'm not a dietitian, and you should consult a dietitian about your specific needs. But in my field, the field of psychology, intuitive eating is something that I explain to clients on both ends of the eating issue spectrum, because once we improve our mind-body relationship and remove any negative coping mechanisms with food, we can more clearly hear what our intuition is telling us. And in most cases, unless, like I said, there is an organic issue, it's usually trying to do us a favor. Another everyday way to use your intuition is intuitive test taking. If you identify as a horrible test taker, the issue might be that you are actively going against your intuition when you should instead be listening to it and using your intuition to inform your decisions on tests, particularly on multiple choice questions. Let's say that you read a question and you go, oh, it sounds like the answer is A. But then you reread the question and you think, oh, but B is partially true too. And, oh, but C is a word I've never heard before, so maybe I actually don't know the answer because I skipped this part of the reading, and maybe C is actually the answer. Now, of course, you should read the full question on tests, but personally, on multiple choice questions, when I'm reading them, I first cover the answers and try to remember for myself what the answer is. And then I write it down, I lift my hand, I look at the other options, and I see which one is closest to what I wrote. This is a great way to hear your intuition out before you drown it with self-doubt. And as a rule of thumb, if you've never seen a word before it shows up on a test, it's probably not that. Give yourself a little credit, don't assume so little of yourself that you would pick a word you've never seen in your life. And if you feel like talking yourself out of your initial impulse, consider not doing that. Yeah, some questions are meant to trip you up, but if you have confidence in the fact that you studied everything you could with the resources you had, watch out, watch out, watch out.
That's why you wanted to know how long I was gone. I thought it was because you missed me.
Of course I miss you. Then your trust in your own intuition should override your fear that it's a trick question. Also, when you're studying for a test, use your intuition to decide what to prioritize. Oftentimes we have all the signs we need about what a teacher or a professor is going to want us to focus on. Like maybe they're reviewing it in the next session, or they're spending a lot of time talking about it. But we instead choose to focus kind of indiscriminately on anything and everything. What if instead, before you start studying, you sit down in front of all the readings and the lecture slides and your notes and make a list of all the topics you intuit will be on the exam. And then afterwards, you can go through that list and see if you were right. There may still be a couple questions that catch you out of left field, but if your teacher isn't out to get you, you'll probably see that you already knew what was going to be on the test. That's another great way to use intuition every day, is test taking. And the third example of using intuition every day that I'm going to give is intuitive decisions about relationships. In relationships, our intuition might occasionally scream at us, walk away from this person, or this person is safe, and we sometimes ignore it. So if we learn to give intuition a seat at the table in our decision making, we may end up safer because of it. For example, growing up, I was not very good at picking friends, and usually my family members would say that. They would say, watch out for this person, I have a bad feeling about them. And I would childishly say, oh my god, that's so judgmental. You would tell me to stay away from someone based on something as whimsical as a gut feeling. That's so unfair to people, yada yada yada. And of course, those people eventually show their true colors, and my long-lasting friends are all people that my family members liked from the start, and they ask about and they love these people. My issue with what they were saying was this false assumption that if you stay away from someone because of your intuition, because of unconscious judgments, rather than conscious judgments, that it's somehow like a hate crime to them. But there's nothing hateful about simply keeping your distance because you're not sure if someone is safe yet. You can be perfectly kind and compassionate and respectful to someone while keeping your distance until you figure out what it is your intuition is trying to tell you. An important caveat here is that you have to simultaneously be putting in the work, digging into your own biases, journaling, doing shadow work, going to therapy, talking about it, while you keep your distance. Because otherwise you're just keeping your distance for nothing without getting any insight into what it is your intuition is trying to communicate to you. This way, if you're actually being biased against someone or you're projecting something from your past onto a current person in your life, you can process that and then use that to inform your decision to move forward with this person. For example, let's say that you went to a friend's house for the first time, and after you left their place, you just had a bad feeling about them. So after that, when they wanted to hang out, maybe you kind of pushed them away. Maybe after some deep reflecting, you realized that you first started to get a bad feeling after you walked past their bedroom. And you ask yourself, okay, why is that? Why was their bedroom in particular triggering you? Maybe it was that you saw they had their clothes all over the floor and it reminded you of the bad mental state that you were in a couple years ago. And then you think about it a little more and you realize that, yeah, actually they are showing several red flags, that they're in that same headspace that you were in, and that they might actually not be in a place where they can be there for you. Or maybe you realize that you were being triggered by their messy room because you're projecting your own fear about getting into that bad headspace again. That actually this person is very nice, they're not showing any red flags, they're not letting their mental health negatively affect the people around them, and your intuition was actually trying to tell you something you needed to learn about yourself, not about them. So use your intuition to make decisions in relationships too. Now let's get into the big question. How do you discern between anxiety and intuition? How can you turn anxiety into intuition? This is a great question that I got a few months ago actually on a video, and it was asking how can you trust your intuition if you have anxiety or intrusive thoughts or OCD or ruminative worries. And since then, I've been reading into this as much as possible, and I finally have a few answers. I feel like they're not the complete answers, but I have some ideas. The first thing is, intuition comes from a place of love, not from fear. In the book Warrior Goddess Training by Heather Ashamara, she talks about how intuition is a feeling, not a thought, and a feeling of love rather than fear. And she mentions an instance where she had a random intuitive impulse to visit her neighbor. And she did so, and she found out that that neighbor was going to hurt himself that night. And after she spent the evening with him, he decided not to. And the key here is that she didn't have an intrusive, frightening thought that said, your neighbor's in danger, get there right away, or a flickering image of something bad happening to him. Instead, she had a feeling of love, of wanting to check in on someone that she cared about. Another example, when I was in Hawaii last month, some of us were driving in one car and some in another. And I randomly decided to pull down the window to take a video of our surroundings. And that's when I felt the smell of rubber burning. And I turned to my mom, who said, oh yeah, I smell it. And we pulled over to check on the car, everything was fine, and we continued driving. And then my mom had this random, completely anxiety-free impulse to call my dad, who was driving the other car, just to tell him about what happened for no apparent reason. And it turned out that he had been driving with the handbrake on for 5 miles and hadn't realized it. And if they had gone any further than that and my mom hadn't called them, the tires may have caught fire and they were about to enter a zone where there was no phone signal. So if you're stuck on whether something is anxiety or intuition, one technique is to ask yourself, is this coming from a place of fear? Because anxiety or OCD is all about fear. I should check whether my friend is hurt sounds very different from I should check up on my friend, I want to make sure she's safe. For instance, if you're considering whether or not to stay up late with your friends on a Friday night, your impulse might be to think, no, I want to stay home tonight, I shouldn't stay up late, I won't be able to sleep in tomorrow morning, and then I won't be able to do my homework if I'm tired, etc. But if you break that down, you're basically just catastrophizing. Realistically, you'll still be able to do your homework if you stay up another 2 hours. And this is coming from a place of fear, not of love. If you put away the fear for a moment, you may realize that you're actually really excited to live up the summer, spend time with your friends, have a pleasant night out for once, and that your intuition is actually telling you to do the opposite of what your anxiety is telling you. Now, I won't lie, I'm sure there are times when intuition does come to us through anxiety, but I think those are rather the exception. And even if it is intuition, Freaking out about it is not going to solve the issue. We'll talk about how to approach these situations later on, but catastrophizing, even if it is your intuition, that's not going to solve the problem. And now a lot of the rest of this video will be largely on a book called The New Feminine Brain by neuropsychiatrist Mona Lisa Schultz. So the second way of handling anxiety versus intuition is examine your bodily sensations. Dr. Schultz talks about how when we ignore our intuition, it starts to scream at us through our bodily symptoms because it demands to be heard. She talks about the 7 intuitive mood centers, which I believe are based on chakras, I think she said. And the 7 mood centers are safety and security, which shows up in the bones, joints, blood, and immune system. Relationships and finances, which show up in the reproductive organs and lower back region. Responsibility and work, which show up in your digestive organs and your weight. Emotional expression and nurturance, which show up in the heart, breasts, and lungs. Communication, will, and timing, which show up in the mouth, neck, and thyroid region. Perception, thought, and morality, which show up in the nervous system, eyes, and ears. And life purpose, mortality, and spirituality, which show up in life-threatening illness. So for instance, if you're having trouble identifying what your intuition is telling you, and you're having a lot of lower back pain, that's the sensation associated with it, you may want to check in on your relationships and financial situation. Now, I don't know how evidence-based this model is. I would love to see some studies verifying these correlations in a generalizable way, but what I can tell you is that in Dr. Schultz's questionnaire, I checked most of the boxes for the mood center that I do have the most issues with. Obviously, that's just anecdotal evidence and we cannot make conclusions based on a sample size of 1. With that being said, I would love to hear whether you felt that this was accurate for you based on your primary concerns in the comments down below. The next step is, after you've identified your feelings and sensations, identify the trigger. If this is sensory intuition, there will be a trigger. So you unconsciously notice something that you now have to make conscious. If this is extrasensory intuition, the trigger might make itself known later. Like one time my dad said he was watching TV and he felt a tear randomly roll down his cheek. And he found out the next day that that was approximately just the moment when his grandpa died. So that's an example of extrasensory intuition. So if you find the trigger, you can see whether this is actually intuition or whether it's just anxiety. Let's say that you're watching TV and you start to feel anxious. So you start to go backwards to remember when this emotion first started. Let's say it started around a specific scene, so you backtrack to that scene and see that it was when a specific character joined the storyline. Why would that make you anxious? Does the character remind you of anyone from your past? Does their behavior remind you of anything that you're going through right now? Let's say that this character reminds you of a friend that you once knew a few years ago. Now, there are a few options. Either this friend brings up something in you, some sort of projection, like maybe they make you feel inadequate. In other words, this is anxiety we're talking about. Or maybe this is an extrasensory sign that your friend's going through something kind of rough lately. Maybe now that you're thinking about it, you just realize that they've been absent from social media for a few months, and now your intuition is telling you, hey, you should check in on them, they might not be okay. The next step is consider the possibility that your intuition's message is about someone else, not you. Oftentimes when we start to feel anxious, we assume that it's because we did something wrong or something bad is about to happen to us. It's kind of the nature of anxiety. But we have to consider the possibility that we are unconsciously empathizing with someone else and assuming that our intuition is about us when in reality it's not. For instance, when we are unconsciously noticing red flags about someone and we start to get a little more jittery or irritable or inexplicably uncomfortable around them, we may assume it's our anxiety, that there's something wrong with us. And I've had this feeling several times with like YouTubers when I'm watching someone's video, and with each one, I just inexplicably have a bad taste in my mouth. And usually when that happens, it takes me a few months after that point to put my finger on what exactly it was about them that didn't quite sit right with me. Another example is, let's say that your friend comes over and they're a little bit tense, and you're picking up on this, you're really empathizing with their tension, and you immediately assume that it's about you, that you did something wrong. That's an example of misattributing your intuition, because what your friend could be going through might have nothing to do with you, but you're letting it turn into anxiety and take over your life. So don't assume your anxiety means you're doing something wrong. Maybe you're picking up on some red flags in the people around you. Maybe you're unconsciously empathizing with them and noting something bad that's going to happen in their life, not necessarily yours. The next step is, once you've identified if this is coming from a place of love versus fear, you've identified the trigger, you've identified the subject of your intuition, you've identified the bodily sensations, make an intuition-informed decision and/or radically accept reality. Now, if this is anxiety, you need to work through that and let it go. I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of emotional regulation or coping with anxiety right now, because I have a lot of videos on that topic and it's not very specific to intuition. But if you've identified that this is anxiety or projection or etc., it's just, it's not intuition that we're talking about here, you need to work through that. If your intuition is telling you something, you need to figure out what it is it's trying to tell you and then make an informed decision based on that. You don't necessarily have to go along with what your intuition is telling you to do, but do keep it in consideration at least. For instance, if your intuition is saying stay away from someone, but you run in the same social circle as them, you may decide to ignore your intuition. It may still bite you in the ass later on, but ultimately it is your decision. If there is nothing you can do, then let go of control. Worrying will not change what's going to happen, so you might as well relax for the ride. So this is your intuition telling you this person's in trouble, or this mistake that you made last week is catching up with you and you can't fix the situation. Don't panic, it won't help with anything. The second to last step is you have to let go of self-doubt in order to hear your intuition. In many cases, it's not your intuition that's lacking, it's your own faith in yourself that's stopping you from accessing it. Like I mentioned in the example with test taking, it's your own self-doubt that is making you not hear your intuition, that's blocking that information. Some ways to let go of self-doubt might involve therapy, positive affirmations, mindfulness, imagery, assertiveness training, letting go of people in your life who bring down your self-esteem. It could really be its own video in and of itself. And lastly, the last step is to keep an intuition journal where you jot down how it felt, what you decided, and then what happened. And this can be a great way to track any patterns and figure out where it's your intuition and what are some dead giveaways that it's not your intuition, that it's just anxiety. Hope this was helpful. Have a great day.